This is a program about donation land claims, and this is the first of I hope of many, because I would like to have other people in the community come in and do their donation land claim pioneers, so we can learn more and see more pictures. Bill Galbraith just brought his whole family history, and it looks fabulous. I wish I was that organized. Anyway, Duffy Hamilton, and which is our main speaker, and she's going to talk about the donation land claim itself, the official certificate or whatever, and then Phil Galbraith is, yes, and then Phil Galbraith is going to talk about his ancestors who are on a donation land claim.
Do you want the little microphone? Okay. Yeah, just push the button on the side. If the blue light is on,
Yeah, it's on.
it's on. You're hot.
I'm hot. Is this directional too?
Yes.
Okay, please forgive us if we have any blunders and oopses, because we're not professionals like you're accustomed to having for your program. But we've been asked, and thank you, Mary Leslie, because I had never actually done much research on the Donation Land Claim Act of 1850. I just called it DLC, and have all of these relatives in the red on this side are my donation land claim holders. You can read it later. Okay. I think that the Donation Land Claim Act of 1850, approved by the United States Commerce September 27th, 1850, as the most important thing that happened to the Oregon Territory. It provided the means for people to claim land. But the main theme of this particular act was to name a person, a position, called the Surveyor General. He was paid $2,000 annually. He was given an additional $4,000, now this is 1850, to provide an office, an assistant, and partake of the supplies that were needed. He was also limited to surveying at no more than $8 per mile. And I think it's important that we distinguish what the contents of it is. Is that me popping?
A little bit.
Sorry about that. Okay, there's 14 sections, and they're going to sound like 20 or 30 by the time I get through. But this is first and foremost was the appointment of the Surveyor General, and then his duties to have an area surveyed, and as I said, not more than $8 per mile. Now, Oregon is probably still the best surveyed state in the United States. The land was exempt for forts and arsenals and whatever else the United States president deemed necessary. You were eligible if you were over the age of 18 and a citizen excuse me, of the United States. And the wording also included half-breed Indians, and women were also able to partake of this. They were not excluded like many, many times. The grants were available and had to be fulfilled. The requirements for the applicants to improve the claim for 4 consecutive years. That means they had to cultivate, reside, and partake of whatever was needed to improve. The act differs from the Homestead Act of 1862, which maybe some of you are familiar with, because it did not mention women. And the head of the house was the only one who could apply, and it was a 5-year stint. And it was much less in acreage, 160 acres, I believe. The 1850 Act was for 320 acres for a single man, 640 if you were married or could prove that you were going to be married 1 year from December 1850. I don't know how they prove that. Oh, the wife's half, as I mentioned, was always in her name. This was not something that he took and grabbed. And all of this was provided it didn't clash with the provisional territorial government. And as the land was occupied and cultivated prior to 1850, you had to have proof presented to the court or to the surveyor general. You could not receive more than one claim. You don't be greedy. And you had no mineral rights. It didn't include that. The formal directions for the, whatever my word is, procurement, was within 3 months of the survey, 3 months from the time of commitment, the settler must notify the surveyor general of the tract or tracts and after the survey. And 12 months from then, each of them had to present to court or to the surveyor general their progress so far. And it was to have to be satisfied by the surveyor general and 2 disinterested witnesses who were not related or in any way connected to you. In the 4th year, a certificate was issued. They called them in one instance patents rather than deeds. And I have, and I believe Bill has some copies of what they actually did receive. And then I have one relative that was Canadian and had to apply for citizenship too. So it was much, much thicker. And this particular relative's donation land claim is now part of the city of Estacada. And then I have a transfer from Solomon Richardson to one of my great-great or maybe 3 times great-grandfathers of his donation land claim to add to Adam Shaver. And Adam, his 2 brothers, and his widowed mother already had about 1,000 acres over there where Durham sewage plant and the elementary school, and then with this, the high school in Tigard are now located. And I found something interesting, not in this article, but in prior reading, that the widowed woman of a man was referred to as a relic.
Now what's your point? I didn't see that out loud, did I?
Pages at once. Where am I? Oh, let's see, I've gone through all of that, I guess, from memory. Oh, I found some interesting things in the wordage of this act, and that was that they couldn't fraudulently, let's see, how do they put it? Oh, before a court of competent jurisdiction. They would be hard pressed, I think, to find a competent jurisdiction these days. Sorry, Judge. And then persons making false or fraudulent oaths or affirmations, false or fraudulent, are subject to all the pains and penalties of perjury. I don't think that scares anybody nowadays. Okay, my connection with the Bird family, which was what Mary Leslie mentioned, was through Rachel and Robert, and I don't know how much any of you have heard about all those birds in our family tree, but I think everybody in Tualatin was originally related. You see, Bill has a lot more current information and more interesting information. But I want to add, tell you, those of you who've heard me say this 1,000 times if you know me, but I'll repeat it. My mother, Blanche Durst, in 1907 was born in Tualatin. My grandmother, Ethel Hedges, was born in 1888 in Tualatin. And my great-grandmother, Emma Cummins Shaver, was born in 1866 in Tualatin. And I'd always been quite proud of that and mentioned it to anybody that would hold still. But, you know, now I get to thinking, my family didn't get around much. Bill, you want to take over? I think I covered this. I'll leave it out for anybody. It's two sides. Very interesting reading, really, if you're an Oregonian enthusiast. Bill Galper.
Can you hear me without this?
Bill, I would like you to use it anyway for the
Okay.
recording, please.
Just before I get started, these are the affidavits and, well, first of all, it's the certificate for the filing of the claim, and then it's all of the affidavits that you had to file with it. And I've got several sets of them down there, so more than one person can look at them at a time, but it's fascinating that you had to have two witnesses sign your affidavit that as to when you came to the territory and when you became a citizen, and on and on and on.
Could you use the speakerphone a little more, please?
There's a way to put that
Is it
around.
not, I'm not.
Just snap it in the back.
Put that on your, right around your neck, just a minute.
This is it.
No, this is.
There's a magnet.
Take it off.
No, this will work. Try that.
Okay. Is it working?
Let's see if
I can hear it.
I don't know, you haven't said anything.
Just start talking.
Okay. But the interesting thing that I found when I was collecting these things, I'm absolutely convinced that Bird Wagon Train was very inbred, because all of the people in there are making affidavits for everybody else, and then they're a witness on the affidavit, and then the person that the affiant is coming back and being a witness for everybody else, and it's just fascinating. Just run through it when you get it out. One of the things I'd like to do before I start is, and I don't know how much time do I have. At any rate, I'd kind of like to make a disclaimer so you understand where I'm coming from. I'm here because there was an interrelation between the Cummins land grant and the Galvez land grant. And then grandfather married Rachel Cummins, and then when, well, Rachel Bird. Okay. And then when Irwin died, Rachel and Joe bought the land grant and then a bunch of other land that he acquired. But I'm always worried about local history, and I want you to know that I have experienced some of the stuff that I'm talking about, but most of my information has come from my older brothers and my older sisters, because they got the information from Grandpa Joe, and then it's just kind of been passed down through the family. I do remember Grandpa Joe, but most of my memories of him are vague. I remember my Italian grandfather because I was 4 when Grandpa Joe died, but I still remember him. I remember he was very big. And then we used to have a big grandpa and a little grandpa. The little grandpa was Grandpa Brzesco, and I'm very familiar with him. And he came in 1877, the late comer. But I have very strong memories. In fact, I was at his bedside when he died, and he died 20 minutes after my father died in the same night. And it was the day before we were going to move into the new house. But at any rate, when you talk about local history, you really want to know who you're talking to, and if you're going to use the information to move on, you want to know what the guy or the person's agenda is when they're telling you the story. And I'd like to diverge a little bit to tell you what I'm talking about. An example of what I'm talking about is Lois in the history of Cullen, and she and her partner did a fantastic job with that book, and you can trust everything you read it. My brother and sister were, not miffed, but they were upset a little bit about what was the gal's name, Gore?
Helen Gore Jennings.
Yeah, about my grandfather Joe being named as a person of interest in the murder, and they just didn't think it should be told. Well, the fact of the matter is that it happened, and I remember the family talking about it. In fact, my older sisters, my aunt, and my mother used to refer to her as that woman. And frankly, I was kind of proud that the story was in there. Grandpa Joe was an example of the old adage, just because there was snow and there was no sun, there's not a fire inside.
But it was in the Oregonian.
Pardon me? Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. The story was true, and it was in the paper, and she substantiated it. But contrary, and the reason I'm telling this is because it involves young Don Galbraith, who was an infamous teacher in the old Fallen High School. The author of this other local history book had a story in it that my dad, John Galbraith, lost a filbert orchard to a Chinese gambler, and that my mother was very upset about it. She attributed the story to Mary Sergino, and I don't know if you know, the author mistook Don for John or John for Don, or whether Mary's memory wasn't that accurate, or whether Mary was concerned about upsetting Aunt Bess, because it was actually Don, my Uncle Don, the father of Don with the football coach, that lost the orchard. And I can prove it because I was 8 years old at the time it happened. And he lost the orchard because his son Donald, after he became a teacher at Tualatin, or after he was through being a teacher at Tualatin, he was a Portland policeman, and he was a bagman for the police department, and he picked up the bribes at the gambling joints. But he unfortunately became involved in gambling and lost some money, and my Uncle Don deeded the orchard to the gambler's wife for $2,000. This was in 1938, so it was considerably gambling debt. But you see, she relied, the author relied on that story without ever checking it out. She never talked to anybody in the family, and she could have done it without even talking to anybody in the family, because he could have gone over and got a copy of the deed. And all of the information there was to know that it wasn't John, it was Don. And I've got a copy of the deed if you want to see it. But
You have to tell them that you live right now on the
oh,
donation.
yeah, okay, yeah. I live on the Cummins Land Grant. and have. I mean, I spent my entire life there. Although I've been away from military service, and I practiced law in Eastern Oregon for 50 years, but it's still my home, and it's still the Cummins Land Grant. But at any rate, all I'm saying is that I'll tell you what I know, or what has been passed to me, and what I believe. Now, if you have a different bent on particular history, I'm going to listen to it, and if you convince me, fine. But don't think I'm trying to dress up anything. Okay, I'll talk first about the Cummins Land Grant, which is the onion plat up here. And that's why I've always been in an argument ever since Fish and Wildlife has started to restore the property to its native state. The fact is that was called a swamp grant under the Act. The federal public domain statute that covered that, in 15 of the states, Michigan was one, and of course Florida, and all had what they called swamp grants, and the grant was for reclamation. The Fish and Wildlife acts as though it was something that came in under the Roosevelt administration, but the fact.
Could you tell the newcomers where your land is, Sipol and the Tualatin Refuge?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's the black dirt that floods over every year up there off of Sipol Road. As a matter of fact, that whole swamp was part of the Cummins Land Grant. And the reason Irwin Cummins took that swamp grant is because he was born and reared in Steuben County, New York. and Steuben County, New York is the onion capital of the 1780s and so on, and it, as a matter of fact, it still does produce a lot of land there. And the dirt is called beaver dam, and it comes from the swamp in Steuben County and in Washington County. It was the beavers out and the onions in, that's what it boiled down to. But at any rate, the grant is for a quarter and 2/2 of a quarter. Is that thing down in front of me? I don't know. Where'd you put it?
Oh, the little one?
Oh, here. This is Site-Hole, we've got to put certain now. This is Site-Hole Road, and this is 99W, as you can see. And this is the Onion Flat. And this is where the bridge goes across at Rock Creek. And if you, I don't know if you ever noticed it, but the ditch that runs through the middle of that is called the Commons Ditch. And it was dug with a team of horses and a slip scraper. And I still happen to have the slip scraper under my barn. So that I can tell you actually happened. But then he also had across Rock Creek. Rock Creek used to wander out into the Onion Flat, but my Uncle Don and Granville Weckard straightened. That's why when you go over the bridge and you see Rock Creek running in a straight line like that, they did that to recoup more of the ground. Well, anyway, that's okay. The other thing that I'd like to mention about that is that Irwin Cummins was a real engineer because he was the one that actually drained that swamp. And he, I don't know if you ever noticed it, in the, sometimes in the winter when there's a soft snow on there, you can see the pattern of all the underground ditches that are in that. On the piece of ground, my house is actually on the adjoining land grant, which Irwin had purchased in addition to the donation claim. But the ditch, and right at the base where the beaver dam starts, I've counted in excess of 25 springs around in there. That's where the water comes from that created the swamp. And he had laid out a pattern. Every 40 feet, they had an underground ditch, and it was made by taking 6 8-inch diameter poles and laying them parallel to one another, and then putting split wood on them. I mean, that reclamation project was not a government-sponsored one. It was one guy that was doing really what the Corps of Engineers would probably take 2 years to do. But they, and it also worked as the irrigation system. In other words, what in in the summertime, when the onions needed water, they would, as those things would pattern down, they could open that ditch and just shove a board in it and sub-irrigate it, back the water up underneath the crop. And that had been the pattern since the 1850s. And I know the logs were there. I mean, I'm telling you it to you straight because I've dug up one of those logs. What they do is they go in and lay a pattern of logs over the spring, and then they run that log ditch out from there and then cover everything over. And it's been about 8, 10 years ago. The black hole broke down, and so I dug 400 feet of ditch by hand. And I happened to dig into one of those springs that were covered with those logs, and I got a chunk of the log that came up from there. I was always going to have it age dated, but then I figured that then I'd have to be bothered with a bunch of bureaucrats coming around. But there's no question that thing was down there in that water, and it's been preserved. And I'm sure there's pieces of those logs all over there. I plowed them up. Then my father, my grandfather took over from it and maintained those ditches. And then my father, when he bought the McNulty place next to the land grant, he set a sawmill up and cut 2x6s and made ditch boxes. I mean, they'd take the 2x6 and tack it down, and then they'd lay 2x12s on top of that, and that replaced the logs. And then the 50s came along, and my brother got some government money, and those wooden box ditches were replaced with clay tile. And right now, all of those old...
I'm sorry.
No problem.
ever
I
calls
thought it was
me.
me, and those clay tile are still there. And I have gone in between the 40 feet and a little deeper down, put plastic, 6 and 8 inch plastic down there, just because I get a little more drainage on the thing. But the pattern is there that Irwin Cummins put in the 1850s, and it works. The other thing that I would mention about Irwin that I think is fascinating is the financial part of it. I haven't figured out whether he was an entrepreneur or whether he was just a land speculator, but in doing the research on the land grant and that abstract that I got, that's my dad's abstract for the piece of land that he bought that was not part of the land grant. But I discovered that Irwin bought that property in the 1860s, I think it was, from the original donee, and then he sold portions of it off. He paid $800 for it. That's a consideration on the deed, and I don't know. You know, at that time, a lot of times, so people didn't want to advertise what they paid for anything. They just put $1 and other valuable consideration for the consideration on the purchase. But on the deed that Irwin got from Garlic for that piece of adjoining property, it shows that he paid $800 for 214 acres. But then he sold 140 of it about 2 years later for $500. So, and then subsequently, I don't know how McNulty ended up with the other half of that grant, but that was the 120 that my dad bought out of the McNulty estate, which joined the Cummins land grant and joined the land that my grandmother and grandfather had divided up among the kids, and my dad got, I think it was 25 or 30 acres of the Cummins land grant, which I now have. And I think, all in all, I think I've got 41 acres of the Cummins land grant. I bought a couple of 5 and 10 acre pieces that were part of the land grant but that had been sold to other people. The other thing that I noticed about, I mentioned that Irwin had his hands in a lot of the different pieces. He also bought I have been trying to find the name of the donee of the donation to the west of the over in this area here, because Grandpa Joe, when they divided up his property, pieces of it went to the kids clear down Herman Road. I mean, that was part of what my grandfather Galbert had purchased from the Martha Bird Cummins, the widow of Irwin. Where was I? I'm sorry. Pardon me?
May I interject something?
Sure.
This Irwin Cummins that he's talking about, that comes down from Bird to Galbraith, is your 2 times great-grandfather?
No, he's my great-grandfather.
Just
Yeah,
great-grandfather?
yeah.
Okay, and he's my great-great-grandfather?
Yeah.
And also, you haven't mentioned that the Galbraiths own 3 of the 4 corners of
I'm
the...
getting to that.
Oh.
I just wanted to go through the comments first because as a follow-up to
Donation.
what donation land claims and her connection with the Cummins. Yeah, they commented, well, there was one other thing I wanted to tell you about Irwin. As I mentioned, I've already mentioned that Irwin had purchased this piece in section 28. The main piece is that this is the southwest quarter of section 20, and then he had half of a quarter running to the north and half of a quarter to the east, so it came up for 320 acres, which is what the act provided for. And interestingly enough, though, the patent that they got after that big stack of this stuff in 10 years, Duffy tells me that it was only 4 years that they had to prove up the land, but yeah. And which is true. I had always understood that it was longer than that, but he didn't get his patent until 1866, which was signed, I'm sure, by somebody else, but it says Andrew Johnson on it. But Irwin Cummins, in addition to this, also had ended up with part of the Bird grant over around Wofford, was it? Yeah. As part of Martha's inheritance from Robert. Yeah, Robert. But he had, I mean, his fingers were in, so far I've found at least 5 or 6 pieces of property. You know, with, I've got copies of mortgages from the late 60s that he had loaned money to people on. And then, interestingly enough, I found the satisfaction of a mortgage that where he borrowed money from a Marcella Goodwin in Idaho City, Boise County, Idaho Territory in 1854. I mean, I've got the mortgage. I haven't brought them because they're fragile. I mean, they're rather old. But I have copies that I was going to bring them, and I forgot them. But and a lot of this stuff, you know, everybody says, well, why did they dig this stuff up? Well, the Cummins house was a big house. I got a picture down there of Rachel and my uncles and aunts when they're about anywhere from a year to probably, well, I think Uncle Buzz was 12 or 14. But that picture of that house is Rachel and Joseph Galbraith's house. But the Cummins house was a very large house, really beautiful, that set, are you familiar with Cypole Road, where Herman runs into Cypole and then it runs down and makes a 90-degree turn and goes out to 99. Well, just after you make that 90-degree turn heading to 99 was where that house sat. And it was still in existence. My Uncle Raymond and Aunt Gertie were living in that house when I was going to grade school. Well, I think they lived in it until, probably the late 50s. But when that was being torn down after it had passed out the family, my brother Joe and I went down there and pawed through the house and found all of these papers that had been Joe Galbraith, I mean, the original Joe Galbraith, and because he had lived there with well, first they lived there and had Martha Bird Cummins, her mother. They took care of her. See, Irwin died in 1885, I think it was. Don't stick me on these dates. I don't even remember my kids' birthdays. In fact, 2 years ago, I forgot my own. But that's because I think life is meant to be lived in years and not birthdays. But at any rate, we picked all of that stuff out of there, and we still have it. And then a lot of this stuff, when my mother died, my brother was living in the house that we grew up in, and my brother never opened her dresser and anything, and did not use the bedroom that she died in. and he just put a plastic over the top of it, and then he moved into that bedroom and in fact died in it. And then that's when I started renovating the house, 2 or 3 years after Bud died. And I discovered all of this stuff in my mom's dresser. I mean, it goes back. In fact, my father's draft card signed by Lois's grandfather, I guess it would be, from World War I was still down there. But it's the whole genealogy and history, especially of the land, has intrigued me ever since I was in grade school. I was telling Francis that Miss McCormick, her teacher, I'm wandering, I'm sorry, but my grade school teacher, Francis' sister Helen Wager, was in my class in grade school and high school. And Miss McCormick made us write a family history. And boy, I was really impressed when Helen told about her lineage clear back to Daniel Boone. And anyway, that's where I became fascinated with all of this. And history has been really important in the family. And as I say, a lot of the stuff that I'm telling you came down from my brothers and sisters who actually really, well, I think one of the stories that my brother Bud was miffed about on the Gore story was because Bud became a fisherman, fishing with Grandpa Joe. And Grandpa Joe could land the heaviest fish and the lightest line in the country. And Bud was very proud of that. But at any rate, the history's there, and it's there to learn about and be proud of it. The other thing that I'll mention is the Galbraith land grant, which, as you've heard the story, that Tolan used to be known as Galbraith, and that was because well, the map is down there, but I got it right here. I pieced this together, and there's copies of it down there if you have an interest in it. Sam Galbraith, who came in the bird wagon train. As a matter of fact, the Cumminses and Irwin and Martha Bird were, I think, very close to Sam and Sarah because they came from the same county. In fact, I got a census that shows them in the same precinct. I think it was the 1860 census that shows them in the same precinct. That's why I say that the bird wagon train was a bunch of inbred people. But at any rate, to show another connection between Sam Galbraith and Irwin Cummins, first, Sam's and Sarah's land grant was also 320 acres, half to the wife and half to the husband. But it consisted of two halves. It was this is the north half of 24, and this is the south half of 13. And their land grant existed of the south half of the south half of 13, and the north half of the north half of 24. But it ran right down to and included this bend in the Tuolumne River where the bridge is down there. And Sam built, well, first he had a ferry across there. And I used to have, but my brother made off with it. The cars that had the fees for getting across that river, and I think a team of oxen and the wagon was something like a nickel. But at any rate, Sam eventually built a bridge across there, and it became a toll bridge. And then when he got paid for it, he gave it to Washington County, who then was to maintain it after that. And the reason he gave it to Washington County was that Erwin Cummins was the road superintendent at the east end of Washington County. And I have Erwin's commission as his appointment as the road commissioner. So I know that I'm telling you correct on that. But also another interesting thing, at least I think it's interesting, of that Kirk Galbraith, one of Sam's sons, that had I think it was 80 acres down here, part of which actually touched the river. And my brother Joe and I were always going to put a quiet title to it, and there was a chunk of that ran right against the river that had never passed title to anybody. It was still the tax department still showed that sliver of land along there. And when the I-5 went through there, it was called the Banfield Freeway then. But when it went through there, the Highway Commission was trying to get deeds from every descendant of Kirk who had never married, and as far as I know, never had any kids. But all of the nieces and nephews, clear back, it was a great genealogy chart. The condemnation proceeding that they ended up bringing on the thing, because my brother Joe was signed the deed. The listing of the defendants, which were decedents of Kirk, covered 2 pages. And, you know, the Hallmark thing. But at any rate, I guess it's the lady that owned the property that they put all of the apartment houses on down there, brought a quiet title suit on it and took it back. But Joe and I were always gonna do the same thing and give it to the city of Tuolumne for a park. But then she had been paying the taxes on it for all that time and wanted to include it in whatever she was selling the property for the apartments. That's the story that I did.
Was Barbara Stinger going to make some mention yet in the program?
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, okay.
Did Barbara go home?
No, I'm right here, but I can do it another time. Mine's in a little bit of a different section in F12 than you guys's.
I want to say one thing, that your brother Joe did a recording, a video of a tape recording for Washington County, and we have a copy of it here, where he talked about that. And he said, don't tell my brother, because he's a lawyer, and go
I'm
after
sorry.
them. He said, don't tell my brother, because he's a lawyer and he'll go after them.
Art, how much more time have we?
That's what we want.
Let's have up in about 5 minutes of questions. I'm
Well,
sure.
I'm sorry, when I get started on this stuff, I just keep going. I meant to tell you that, sir.
Barb, do you have,
I have a couple just little things I'd like to share. I don't
Okay.
have
And
that
then-
information, but I have a, yeah,
yeah,
Well, since going out, would you tell us your age, so?
how old are you?
85.
Bing,
Yeah,
85.
What?
I'll be 86 in about 4
Duffy,
months.
how old are you now?
None of your business. Bit older.
One thing, I believe that on filing for the patent, there was a fee to pay.
Pardon me?
There was a fee to pay, a fee, and your brother Joe told me that people would save up until they got the fee. And if anybody came around, they just squatted, you know, they could hold their gun on anybody that tried to get their property. But they didn't generally file for the patent until they were ready to sell the land. They didn't really need the patent.
Yeah, the act did not recognize squatting, however. But I'm not questioning that at all, but.
no, you're fine. I'm on a completely different other side. I'm Nathaniel Robbins here, and William Robbins here. So this would be my great-great-great-grandfather, and this would be my this is third, and this is the second grade.
And then what
And
about Ball?
Huh?
Larkin Ball.
Oh, no. Larkin marries Nancy.
Yeah, but he had the donation land claim.
I know, but I'm on the Robbins. I'm not worried about the balls.
You don't claim them?
I know, but I'm just talking Robbins. Anyway, I'm going to tell you the Nathaniel and Williams, and I'm related to Williams' seventh daughter, Nancy, who was 7 years old when she came here. But I just want to tell you just a couple things that what they wrote about. We were able to find a recollection diary, and this is how they talked about coming and getting a donation land claim. It says, about the last of January, I moved out across the Tualatin River, 7 miles from Lynn City, into a cabin on a school section next day. I found a claim that pleased me well with a shanty on it, built by Bird and the Hendrickses to shave shingles in. I moved in on it on the 5th day of February, where I now live, and that would have been William Robbins. So that kind of describes what it looked like. I had to work hard for other people for money to get my bread. My stock all died on the Danelles, but 1 ox, and he was poor as a rake, so I sold him for $75. Father got 5 of his oxen, Young got 3 of his, and 2 mare, and Norville got his mare. So it just talks about how it was in person, and this is what I have. It also, it's in range 1E, and my family sold it about every 2 years once they had it. I mean, Nathaniel might have it, and he might sell it to William, and he might sell it to Norville, but it was right to see. Nathaniel owned part of Section 30, Section 29, Section 31, Section 32, so it's several different families that own this, and it's right next to the William Byrd. And the William Byrd donation land claim is where the William Byrd, Robert Byrd Cemetery is, up off of Stafford. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about that. That's my part of the family. And then Lois is correct. I have some balls, but I was just going to talk about the Robbins today.
I'm sure there's questions.
Yes, Art. This is probably for Duffy. Duffy, when was the first surveying done? And was it done prior to the early settlers? In other words, what if somebody came and saw a piece of land they liked, but it hadn't been surveyed yet, and they put down roots, then what?
Then they had to go and prove to the Surveyor General that they had lived there, that they had cultivated, they had improved. And then that also comes under with a couple of witnesses to verify that they were there. But then that land would then precede 1850. They could start counting from when they were on it, if they could prove when they were on it.
Okay, thank you.
I believe that the provisional government, gave donation land claims. It wasn't the Donation Land Claim Act, but you could file for land under the provisional government before 1850, and the people would get twice as much land. 320 acres for the man, 320 acres for the wife.
Yeah.
This was non-conforming. They did make meets and bounds of their own choosing, and when the survey came, they could keep their claim, but they had to refile. And so there are quite a few land claims, the large ones, 620 acres, before the donation land claim.
Right, the man got 320 and the woman got
Correct.
or 640 for married couples. But then there is this provision in, I shouldn't say provision because you need that for the government. There is this one article, I don't know where it is exactly in the official one, but it says, it refers to what the provisional territorial government has previously said. So that's where all of that fits in.
Right.
Well, one of the things,
Can I ask you a quick question, real quick? This very colorful document that the vast majority of us can't see, I'm sure. I could read top left, 1850 U.S. donation land claim, I could, okay. But then the rest of it is just kind of a graded red blur. Could somebody tell me, obviously, this wasn't what they had in 1850. There's had to have been a lot of edifications between 1850 and now to show us what we're looking at now. But is this, what we're seeing here, is this accurate? In other words, has somebody checked the previous 10 or 15 edifications that go back to 1850?
I think I can respond.
Yvonne helped John Bowles do the smaller version of this, and they should probably be vouching for its authenticity.
One of the things that I assume what you're talking about is the property lines and all of that. What they were worried about here was the section lines, and as Duffy mentioned, Oregon had the best setup, but I think the Willamette Valley had the best setup because all of the sections that are laid out here, they're finding with the shooting the moon and all of that stuff, that those things, those quarter corners and everything are accurate. In Eastern Oregon, it's a little bit different. I spent 55 years over there and did a lot of property stuff, and the interesting thing over there, she mentioned that they were paid $8 a mile, and I think it's evidenced in Eastern Oregon because what they did, instead of running the chains and the lines and everything, they would paint a line on the side of the tire and then count the revolution. and all over Eastern Oregon, you will find the quarter corner of section 13 might not match the quarter corner of section 24. I mean, the line comes down and then it jumps over. And the surveyors take that into account. They always have. And of course, I spent half of my first 10 years in Eastern Oregon, the town of Weston. When they laid that out, that one guy started from one end and one guy started from the other side. And so consequently, there are a lot of overlaps in it. And I made my living off of quiet title suits for about
If I could add to your discussion, we have a pretty important meridian that goes right down what is now called 65th, called Meridian Road. It separated the Washington County from Clackamas County, but it also leads up to the Willamette Stone, where Preston started all of the surveys of Oregon down to the border and over to Idaho. The Willamette Stone is still there up behind St. Vincent's Hospital, and the line that goes parallel to the west is called Baseline, and you can see Baseline Road at various places going to Hillsborough in that area.
No,
We're very close to, all property descriptions are based on a meridian line and baseline.
No, they, you know, like you say, they've got all these modern instruments and everything, but I think those surveyors did a hell of a job in getting the job done. Incidentally, there's another thing that you might be interested in, and I always was, that, you know, we're laid out in a grid, square grid, I mean, the mile squares and everything. But in India, they're laid out on triangles. And I forget what it's called, but their land identification is in the form of triangle.
Are there other questions?
Microphone, yeah.
Yeah, I am always impressed by the linearity of a map like this, but tell me about the mechanics. I mean, a person would come out, would travel out here in one of those wagon trains and find a piece of property they liked and reside on it. But how did they, I mean, they didn't have, how was it then determined that that was a space that was available, that somebody had not already filed a claim against? Or whatever else.
You mean on the
ownership?
On the donation land claims?
Right.
Pardon me? Well, no, but that was what the land office was all about.
They took their survey, was topographic and geophysic too. They did a finite job of surveying. And there weren't enough people out here to step on each other, really.
And they used iron stake. A lot of the stakes down there on the swamp, on the Onion Flat, are still down in the ground there. I mean, I personally have taken a metal detector and found where the stakes were on the property that I bought down there.
Well, as I understand it, just from reading about the Robbins part of the family, is that you found a spot and there were maybe other people that were around you, and then you went to the asset office, which would have been in Lynn City, not Oregon City, Lynn City, and then they applied for it. Then you went back, and what my family did is then they went back and the first thing they did is they started planting food so they would have something to eat. That was the most important thing, is to have something to eat. And then they had the shacks. Then they put their families out from Oregon City or Lynn City, and that was where they started their homes. But they actually went to the asset office and would find, you know, it's such and such, and it's by, maybe it would have been Bird, and maybe the other one would have been Robbins or something, and they would find it, and that's where they would apply for it. But now my family didn't get their certificate or whatever it's called, and it was signed by Grant, and by President Grant. By that time, my family had sold it. They sold it in 1876. So it's an interesting thing about, it's all done differently.
So also, I was wrote letters to John Elliott Allen, who used to write an article in the Oregonian every year. He's the one that wrote the original cataclysm zoning on the Columbia. And he told me all about how they surveyed the chains and the crew that was there. There was a cook crew, and they would mark trees by slashing the tree with an axe and branding it with a number, you know, range, west, so on.
That big tree that's just past Aunt Jane's house up there, that's a monument tree. I mean, it's got a deal on it, you can't cut the thing down. It's been there, well, I mean, I remember it from,
If the tree did go down, they would also often mark a marker tree close to it.
yeah.
So, yeah.
Are there other questions?
Obviously, there weren't roads built back then. So in order to get to your claim, I would imagine you'd have to travel over someone else's claim. And I'm wondering, you know, physically, how did they get that done? How did they move their materials to where they were going to build their home? How did they go about that?
You have to use your imagination.
Well, yeah, I think, well, first of all, the main roads, you know, they were commissioned, for instance, there's the military road down by Roseburg that goes through, and then there's
The Dayton Road.
they had different names, but to get to your land, I think that I've always understood that you got there any way you could. Well, that's where these Boone's Ferry Road came in. All of these guys that had ferries built roads, and they had provisions for condemnation, but I've never found any condemnation cases that go back that far. But I think that it's just everybody having to have the roads to the benefit of everybody.
Well, there were provisional roads, a few wagon trail roads. Tualatin itself at one time had mud and slab, but that was much later. They just did what they could.
Yeah, Barlow Road coming over the mountains. That's what happened with Sam Galbraith. He came out at least in the book that I found on George. George relates a lot. George and Joe was 6 months old. 6 months old when they came. And George was only 2, I think. But they got to the Dalles in the fall, and it was too late to try to come over the mountain. And they came down the river in the flatboat, and Sam left 8 team of oxen and 8 cows and a couple of horses up in the Dalles, and came down the flatboat, and then went back in the spring, and the guy that was taking care of them had sold them and took off for California. But as far as the road to get into, he just made it.
There's a lot of interesting looking things here. What's a quick description of some of the things that we have here?
Oh, Bill's got all kinds of pictures and things. I have the bird storybook that Matthew Porter made, and here's a genealogy.
On your side. Here's genealogy.
Well, bird.
Yeah, the bird genealogy. Okay.
This is Rachel Bird. No, Rachel Martha Bird's daughter, and Sam's daughter and my grandson. And this has always been one of my favorite pictures, and it's one of the crews. I remember the shed, but it was the shed on the Cummins property, and this is obviously, this is probably about, 1905 or something like that. But it has my grandfather Galbert, my grandfather Francisco, and a whole bunch of relatives, and all of the people that had different pieces of ground down there in the swamp. And this is Sam and Sarah Galbraith, Sarah Spence Galbraith. And I'm very proud of the fact that my grandson looks exactly like his great-grandfather. He's a cadet at West Point right now.
Is he the one that established the land grant in downtown Tualatin?
Yeah, he's the one that built the bridge across and had the ferry across the river. And these are their boys. This is Kirk that had the property down there, and this is George who had the farm up here. This is Joe, my grandfather. This is John. John had a huge ranch in Montana, and George, Joe, and John had gone to Idaho to work in the gold mines when they were like 16 to 18, something like that. In fact, that's where a lot of Sam's money came from to put the bridge in and things like that. They started at a very early age earning money, but John brought his cattle down to Portland by rail, and he got involved in a poker game and won heavily, and apparently the loser was upset because he got poisoned. And John is buried out here in the Winona Cemetery, but he had a ranch in Montana. And then this is Captain Oliver, who ran the dredge in the Willamette River, and also out in the Columbia for the Corps of Engineers. And then this is Sam, young Sam.
Yeah, Bill, how many of those are buried at Winona Cemetery?
All of them. Yeah, all of them.
Back home.
Yeah, you go through Winona Cemetery, and there's the Bulls and the Galbraiths and Cummins. Yeah. Well, Cummins are actually over at Burr Cemetery.
Fantastic. This is an incredible amount of original history here. We certainly appreciate you sharing your time and experience and knowledge to enlighten some of us that have been around a lot fewer years.